Crack! "Keep your guard up, Master Opal," said Gontak. The huge, broad-shouldered war form stood a respectful distance from where he had knocked his young charge to the ground. The cluster of barbed horns on his head formed a complex crest, which bobbed and rearranged in a variety of patterns to subconsciously display mood and temperament. Right now it was bowed in servility, but minute twitches hinted at frustration. "Try again," he said. Opal scrambled to his feet. His crest horns were not fully developed, and now they hung limp, a sure sign of boredom and inattention. He made a half-hearted charge at Gontak. Gontak blocked the thrust and whacked Opal across the chitin plates of his back, sending him sprawling. "Guard up, Opal." "That's Master Opal to you, slave," snapped a figure striding into the room. This high form, far thinner and shorter than the weapons master, eyed Gontak with regal distaste. "He is the brood prime of the Kiddick clan someday, First Father, and he deserves your respect." "Yes, sir," muttered Gontak. "Opal, your combat lessons have run late," said the high form. "Run along to your tutor." "Yes, Sixth Father," said Opal. He leapt up, horns nodding into childish delight. He threw down his staff, scampering off excitedly. Sixth Father sighed. He was merely the sixth brother in his brood, and of no position to debate with the decisions of his olders and betters, but it seemed questionable that the education of his clan's sole heir rested in the hands of an alien slave. Opal ran along the halls at a breakneck pace. He dodged maids, sped through the kitchens, skipped down flights of stairs, lower and lower down the enormous tower that made up the bulk of the Kiddick clan's urban estate. Pastel paint and polished chrome gave way to steel, which in turn gave way to orange terracotta. At last he reached a wholly unremarkable door and began knocking furiously. "Squishy," he called, "I'm here for my lesson." The door opened to reveal his tutor. "Master Opal," he said, making a short bow. "It is a pleasure to be seeing you on this fine day. Please come in." Opal entered. Opal's mother had laid no other eggs in his brood, an unusual occurrence in his species, and she doted on him. He had a room filled with rare and expensive toys from across the Brindican rings. He had a room lined wall-to-wall with strange exotic pets. Every night he slept on a bed large enough to fit 12, in a room big enough to fit 8 such beds. Squishy's quarters were neat and cramped. Shelves of worn books covered one wall, a crude blackboard covered the other. An old beaten-up writing desk sat in the corner. A spindly table, a threadbare rug, and a pair of chairs were the only other furnishings. It was Opal's favorite room. "Have you finished the readings that I'd given to you?" Squishy asked. He pulled up a chair for his pupil. Opal squirmed up onto the seat. It was strangely fashioned, Squishy having made it himself to suit his alien frame, but by now Opal could usually sit on it in a comfortable fashion. "I did," he said, "but I had a question about the planets. How come it says they're named after animals, but none of them are?" His tutor's face lit up. "A good question," he said. "The answer, Master Opal, is being that they are indeed named for animals, but not in the language that we are now speaking. They were named by a much older civilization who were the first to identify all 12 planets in this solar system, and who also spoke a very different language than ours." "Then why not just call them by the names we have now? It seems simpler." "That is a much more difficult question," said Squishy. "A question that lacks a clear answer. The closest reasoning to an answer is being that many people do not like changing what they have known for a long time, and also that using old names makes many people feel as if it has more importance. For instance, on my own species' planet of origin, the planets are named after the gods worshipped by the culture that had discovered them." "I guess that makes sense," said Opal. Squishy smiled. "Very good," he said. "Now let us be returning to Chapter 7. They had bought Squishy 3 years ago at the slave markets. Third Father was in need of a new house slave and deigned to descend from the Kiddick clan estate to the teeming streets below. Arm in arm with Mother, he deflected the pressing, insistent merchants peddling low work forms and glanced over the hulking war forms sold by scarred, grizzled dealers. In the Grand Zoo, where slaves of all species and varieties were arrayed, he inspected Gruntharks, hard-working but stubborn and willful, Tillipin, easily controlled but flighty, and Porovo, docile and incapable of nearly any complicated task, when Mother tugged upon his arms. A creature was standing placidly in the corner, a species beyond Third Father's experience. A sign on his chest, next to an astoundingly low price, read simply, "Teacher." Of course, once Mother had seen that, She just had to have the slave. There were precious little visitors to the Brindican rings, and few even of them were educated. Mother insisted that her precious brood-prime child have as broad and wide an education as possible, and this strange creature would clearly expand her son's horizons. Third father was skeptical, but a few minutes' conversation revealed the thing to be fluent in 6 languages, well-versed in the sciences, and impeccably polite. And again, remarkably cheap. This, likely, stemmed from an unappealing physique. The teacher creature towered above third father, almost the height of a war form, but was far too thin and scrawny to be capable of any hard labor. Its head was completely denuded of horns, instead coated along the top in fine black hair. Its skin had no cast color, being the reddish-brown of baked clay, and of course it had no hard spots whatsoever, just soft flesh without chitinous plates. They had bought him and brought him home, whereupon Opal had taken one look at the soft alien and immediately dubbed him Squishy. And that was Squishy, hairy like a rat, naked like a frog. Within 2 weeks, he was Opal's favorite tutor. "Squishy!" Opal beat on the door. "I need to ask you something." He heard frantic motion from within. After a minute or so, Squishy pulled the door open. Rather than his usual meticulous attire, he wore a loose robe made of some fluffed material. His face was speckled with sweat. When Squishy had first been purchased, Opal was fascinated with the way water erupted from his tutor's skin in the hot seasons. Squishy had explained that it was his species' method of cooling during heat and exertion. Indeed, on days when the sun beat down harshly, when masters and slaves alike lay torpid in the shade, Squishy could be found out and about, cheerfully attending to his duties with no sign of discomfort. Squishy took a moment to speak. His chest was heaving, as if opening the door were some gargantuan effort. "Master Opal," he said when he had caught his breath, "my sincere apologies. I was not expecting our lesson for several hours. Please come in." "What were you doing?" said Opal, his curiosity quashing his urgent mission. The room had been rearranged. The desk was pushed against the wall, the table and chairs moved to the bedroom, to clear a wide space in the middle of the room. "And what is that?" He pointed to a bizarre piece of furniture at the edge of the clearing. It looked almost like a coat rack, but with a thick center pole and 3 arms jutting out at odd positions. A 4th arm stuck out and bent sharply towards the ground. Squishy coughed. "That, young master, is, He paused for a fraction of a second. "My dancing partner." "Your dancing partner?" Opal asked, bewildered. "It's a log!" "Yes. Well, I have not been able to find a suitable partner, you see," said Squishy. He seemed almost embarrassed. "Humans are not common travelers, and the Brindic anatomy proves too inflexible for the proper movements. The dummy is useful for my purposes." "Can you show me?" asked Opal. Again, the fractional pause. "I apologize, Master Opal," said Squishy, "but it would likely be of no interest to you. I am badly out of practice, and fear that I would not be able to give the dance justice." "Oh," Opal said, disappointed. "I've never seen a human dance." Squishy smiled. "Perhaps someday," he said, "when I am more confident in my ability. In the meantime, I believe you had a question for me." "Oh yes," Opal said. "I forgot. Mother told me that the whole planet spins around really fast all the time, but if that's true, why don't we go flying off?" "Ah," said Squishy, nodding sagely. "A perplexing problem." Squishy had no crest, but Opal had realized long ago that his race showed emotion through the position of their facial features. He had made a long study of his tutor's face until he could read the alien's moods with comfortable ease, pleasure and enjoyment, the mouth curving upwards, when Opal asked an interesting question, or when the housekeeper told him a particularly droll joke. Respect and obeisance, or was it preoccupation? The eyes staring straight ahead when First Father deigned to address the house slaves. Disappointment and severity, lines above the eyes, mouth curved downwards, when he was down 3 hands in the weekly night of cards he played with the cook and the gardener, and Gontak, and of course, his default expression. The mouth straight, but a hint of a smile. Polite, mild amusement, as if he could see a joke that no one else could. "Why haven't you ever told me a human war story, Squishy?" Opal said, idly swishing a stick about like a sword. He had begun to hit the age when boys become obsessed with glorious battle, and his combat lesson with Gontak had filled him with reckless energy. His tutor paused, hand stretched to pluck the day's lessons from a high shelf. "War stories?" he said. I am begging your pardon, Master Opal, but I did not think them worthy of telling. What do you mean, not worthy? Opal said. Do humans lose a lot? I bet they lose a lot. Is that why you don't want to tell me any? It is not the shame of losing battles, Master, said Squishy. Certainly my species has won and lost its share of wars, the latest of which has resulted in my delivery into your service. The reasoning for my reluctance is that I do not find such stories appealing. You should hear one of Gontak's stories then, said Opal. He told me about when he fought the Mycric clan at the Overflow. He showed me a great big scar on his stomach. He said he killed 17 warforms and never got a scratch. He pulled himself off his seat and began hopping around the room, fencing invisible enemies with his stick. He imagined legions of warforms falling beneath his sword, their lasers skittering off his mighty power fields. His armies were driving the enemy back to the river. They were chanting his name. Abruptly, the stick was yanked back. With a yelp, Opal fell back and smacked against the floor. He looked up to see Squishy peering down at him, holding the stick. And did Gontak tell you of the 17 widows who cried for their lost husbands? He said. The 17 broods crying for lost fathers? He still wore his perpetual expression of mild amusement, but there was suddenly an edge to his voice. The hundreds of Mycric soldiers who died screaming to protect their master's property. The hundreds of his fellow Kittic soldiers who died screaming that your first father might acquire a few hundred square clicks of land? Opal, wide-eyed, scrambled to his feet. I don't... Did you perhaps imagine yourself as their slayer? Said Squishy. Did the possibility not cross your mind for a single moment that you might be the one slain? That a beam overwhelm your defenses for one unfortunate instant, or a blade slip past your guard? The amused expression was gone. In its place was not anger, but a deep and terrible seriousness. That you might be pinned to the ground under the bodies of friend and foe, suffocating and helpless, while the warforms climb over the pile of stinking corpses to butcher you. That would never happen, stammered Opal, now thoroughly terrified. The warforms are forbidden from attacking high forms. Oh, and that is better, is it? Asked Squishy. To kill with abandon, knowing no one will dare raise a hand against you? Slaves bending their necks to your blade for fear of what their families would suffer if they resisted. Is this what passes for glorious combat in the Brindican rings? He threw away the stick with a titch of disgust and turned to face his books, as if Opal were not even in the room. Anger is a time-honored method of clearing fear from the spirit. As his shock faded, Opal was suddenly flooded with outrage. How dare a mere slave speak to him, the brood prime of the Kittic clan? And what do you know about honor? He burst out venomously. Gontak teaches me how to fight and be brave. Are you teaching me how to be a coward? Squishy took a deep breath, still facing the wall. That is not what I am teaching you, Opal, he said. He turned, and his face was still serious. There are indeed moments when bravery is needed, when violence is the necessary path, but they are few and far between, and should never be sought after. And none of them are stories worthy of telling. You think my ancestors' stories aren't worthy of telling? Cried Opal. Righteous fury spurred him on. You're just a slave. I am the sole brood prime of the Kittic clan, heir to its proud dynasty. You stand there and insult your master? He had expected fear or obeisance or anger in return. What he did not expect was the return of Squishy's habitual amusement. Yet in an instant, the brooding seriousness had vanished, to be replaced with that wry smile. Quite articulate when your pride is wounded, it seems, he said. I should remember to jab at it in our writing exercises. He sat down in his desk chair, crossed his legs, smoothed his robes, all as if he were conducting an ordinary lesson. Insulting, you say? Perhaps. But it is a poor teacher that cannot speak the truth as he sees it to his pupil. Is the truth an insult to your clan, Opal? Don't mock me, slave, Opal spat out. I could have you beaten. I could have you sold to the asteroid mines. He needed something, anything, to wipe that smirk from Squishy's face. I could tell anyone a word of what you've said today, and you'd be hung for treason. He stood with a shaking finger pointed at his teacher. Squishy's face changed not a bit. Are you going to? Opal stopped. His rage flagged. Suddenly he saw himself standing there, not as a powerful master disciplining a defiant slave, but as a stupid boy threatening his friend with pain and death. No, worse than that. An unruly child throwing a tantrum at his teacher, His finger dropped and he hung his head. "No," he said. His cheeks burned with shame and sick humiliation. I'm sorry, Squishy." Squishy's expression softened. "I accept your apology, Apple," he said, "and I must apologize myself for losing my temper. Do you accept my apology?" I do. Thank you, Master Apple. And now that we both are treating each other with the respect that we deserve, I would like it very much if, when we are meeting for lessons, you address me as teacher. Is that an acceptable proposal?" "Yes, teacher. Very good. Let us now be discussing Chapter 7, please." "Teacher," said Apple, putting down his pen, "is there anything bad happening right now?" Squishy seemed to pause carefully before answering. "Why would you be thinking that, Master Apple?" It was high summer now, just on the verge of debilitating, but deep within the Kiddick Tower's base, Squishy's rooms were dark and cool. "Everyone has been acting strangely," said Apple. "First father and second father argue all the time, and third father just stays in his rooms all day. Mother has been crying, I've heard her, and none of them have left the house in weeks." His teacher steepled his fingers, a human expression of surprising dexterity. Apple knew it meant that he was struggling to find what to say. "It is certainly nothing for you to be worrying of, Master Apple," he said. "Adults have their moments of conflict and argument, and of course the heat is keeping all of us indoors." "It's not just the heat, teacher," Apple cried. "It's everyone. I've been to the kitchens and none of the servants will talk to me. They just stare through me like I don't exist. I had a combat lesson with Gontak today, and the way he looked at me, I didn't like it." He swallowed. "It scared me. Everyone is strange, and I'm not allowed to go outside the tower and no one will tell me why." He stared desperately at Squishy. "Please don't lie to me, teacher. You're the only one who's even bothered to answer me at all. What is going on?" He halted, confused and lonely, and a little bit embarrassed at his outburst. Squishy was looking at him, fingers still crisscrossed, wearing a grave expression he had not seen since their only real argument several months ago. "Very well, Apple," he said finally. "I will not lie to you, although I would rather not burden a boy of your age with truths such as these." He sighed. "There has been unrest in the conversations of the servants as of late. As I understand it, uprisings have occurred in several clan cities." He paused. "Bloody uprisings." Apple gaped. "Do you think it might happen here?" "Assuredly not, young master, but even so, it has put all members of the house on edge, and it is not something to be easily explained to a child. I would suggest we put it out of our minds and return to our lesson." The air shattered. A concussive wave of sound and force struck the two of them, sending them flying against the walls. When his tumble had finished, Apple lay stunned, feeling the building rock and shake under the grasp of some terrifying blow. As the rumbling died away, he could hear screams beyond the door, screams of terror and yelling, but the yelling was not a cry to maintain order or directions. These shouts were angry, and as they became louder, the terrified screams seemed only to rise in volume. "Teacher," he said. He peered over the upturned table and saw Squishy standing before the entranceway, tensed as if the door itself were about to attack. "Stay behind the table," Squishy snapped. Apple ducked quickly back down. They stayed that way for minutes, listening to shouts indistinctly filter through the door, while more and more screams were cut short. After what felt like an age, the door was yanked open. Behind it stood Hondo the cook and Bodal the gardener, and Gontak behind them. Their crests were flared in full combat pose. All were armed. Bodal had a machete, and Hondo a long, square cleaver. Gontak held his 3 war knives, one a curved slicing blade, one a thin stabber, one a heavy chopping knife. Every blade dripped with thick blue blood. Squishy untensed a fraction as he saw them. They did as well. But, Apple noticed, their crests remained unchanged. "Greetings, Hondo, Bodal, Gontak," his tutor said. "What is happening, please?" "The revolution has come, Squishy," said Bodal. "Across the city, work forms and war forms are throwing off their chains and visiting vengeance on their masters. The first father is dead. We are slaves no longer." Apple shrank back in horror behind the table. Beyond the trio, he saw the body of 8th father draped across the tiles in a pool of cobalt blood. He couldn't see his head. Squishy smiled politely, but his eyes were cold. "Congratulations, my friends," he said. "I am happy for you." There was a long pause, all the friends standing motionless, the three with crests flared, Squishy with his smile that was not a smile. "We are here for the child, Squishy," said Gontac finally. "Move aside." Squishy did not. "The boy is innocent," he said. "He's a high form," said Hondo. "He's tainted. Even the young ones will seek to oppress us again if we give them the chance. It's in their genes. Now move aside." Again, the human did not move. 4,000 years of slavery and torment is a terrible burden to carry, he said. But we would not be people if we could not make our own choices. He glanced back towards Opal, cowering against the wall. This is not a master, or a highborn, or some infective evil. This is a child. Will the first act of free people be the murder of the innocent? All of them tensed. Their crests rattled and thrummed with rage. Hondo stepped forward. "House slave!" he seethed. "I should have known where your loyalties lie. You will take their side even now?" "Opal's side? Certainly," Squishy said, still smiling. "How glorious it must be to make war upon children." Hondo bellowed and swung his great cleaver at Squishy. The human moved like water. He caught at the cook's arm, ducked under the blow, and came up behind Hondo, still holding the cleaver arm now bent at an awkward angle. He pulled upwards. Groaning with pain, the cook was forced downwards. His other arms clawed frantically behind him, but could not bend appropriately to reach the tutor. Squishy gave a powerful wrench on the arm as he struck with his other hand at the elbow joint. There was a staccato beat of meaty cracks as Hondo's arm snapped in two places. The cook shrieked shrilly and collapsed to the ground, clutching at his shattered arm. All took place in less than 5 seconds. Startled but no less enraged, Bodal came forward and swept his machete towards Squishy's head. In the long stretched time of adrenaline, Opal realized exactly what had befallen Eighth Father. Once again, the human became a force of flowing motion. He leaned back, unnaturally back, farther than any Brindican could lean, and the blade swung an inch above his head. He came up before Bodal could recover and kicked savagely at the gardener's knee, which blew out to the side with another sickening crack. Bodal fell sideways, hissing curses through his mandibles, and swung at the human again. This time Squishy stepped inwards, turning away from Bodal to catch the gardener's upper arm on his shoulder, before seizing the machete hand with both hands and wrenching down. Once again, a crack as the elbow joint stretched to its limit and gave. Squishy grabbed the machete from limp fingers and turned to grasp the gardener's head with his free hand, smashing it into the wall in the same motion. A wet crunch, and Bodal slumped unconscious to the ground. This took about 8 seconds. Gasping, the tutor straightened from the tangle of limbs, machete in hand, and turned to the end of the hallway. Gontac stood there, shocked. His knives were lowered, and his crest had sunken, twitching now with stunned surprise and perhaps a touch of fear. But he looked at Opal, peering from the upturned table, and he looked at Squishy, panting and pouring sweat, and back to Opal. And now his crest was up. His knives were raised, and this soft pampered thing was standing between a blooded war form and his vengeance. He took a step forward. Squishy pointed the machete at Gontac. "Do not try it, my friend," he said sadly, but there was steel in his voice. "Please." Gontac snarled and charged. An instant later the human was charging too. Opal came out slowly from the table and moved to the doorway. Past the fetal whimpering cook and the concussed gardener, he could see Squishy and Gontac in the middle of the hallway. The warrior and the tutor were locked together, motionless, tangled in a desperate embrace. Blood trickled from them, mixing with a red, dark liquid to swirl together on the floor. Opal climbed over workform limbs to reach them. He put a tentative hand on his tutor's back. "Teacher?" he asked. "Squishy?" The tangle shifted, and he heard Squishy groan. The human pulled himself free of Gontac with difficulty. 2 of the warform's knives were embedded in his flesh, and as they came free, the strange red fluid began flowing from Squishy's wounds in short pulses. Opal realized that it was human blood, and looked away for a moment, nauseated. Gontac stared at nothing, breathing raggedly. The machete was stuck deep in the thin gap between the chitinous plates of his belly and his chest. As Squishy pulled it loose, the warform's legs suddenly began twitching furiously, thrashing about and stirring up the pool of blood before slowing and finally stopping as his body collapsed. Squishy found a pillar to sit against. His hands were jammed into his stab wounds. His eyes were screwed shut from pain. There is a small bag with a red cross under my bed, Apple, he said. Please get it for me. Yes, teacher, said Apple. He scurried frantically to the bedroom and found it, a black leather bag with a large cross in neat red paint. He returned. Squishy took the bag and pulled a number of strange items from it. As his tutor cleaned his wounds, Apple steeled his nerve. Teacher, he asked, how did you fight like that? How did you learn? I was not always a tutor, Apple, said Squishy. He pinched the edges of a cut shut and pressed a device against it. There was a chunk, and the device moved to reveal a metal staple in the skin, holding the cut together. For a very long time in my life, I did many things that I wish I had not. Chunk. And when it was over, I decided that I would never be that person again. Chunk. He struggled to his feet, using Apple for support. We must be moving quickly now, Apple, he said. There will be much danger in the time ahead. Yes, teacher. Apple hesitated. Squishy, thank you for saving me. As far as gratitude went, it seemed completely inadequate. Squishy smiled at him despite the pain. Few and far between, Apple, he said. We can only be hoping there are no stories told of us.